There are moments in life when power does not arrive with noise. It does not argue. It does not demand attention. It does not even try to prove itself. It simply exists, quietly, patiently, observing everything around it. And when the time is right, it reveals itself not through words, but through change. That moment began on a flight that, to everyone else, felt completely ordinary. The kind of flight people take every day. The kind of journey that begins and ends without leaving any lasting impression. Passengers boarded calmly. Some carried the weight of long days. Others carried the quiet anticipation of where they were going. The cabin welcomed them with soft lighting, smooth surfaces, and the familiar rhythm of travel that required no explanation. Everything felt controlled. Predictable. Peaceful. The kind of environment where nothing unexpected is supposed to happen. And yet, in the middle of that calm atmosphere, something small occurred. So small that most people wouldn't have noticed. So subtle that it could easily be dismissed as nothing. But sometimes, the smallest moments reveal the deepest truths. Among the passengers was a traveler who seemed completely ordinary. No visible urgency. No attempt to stand out. No sign of status or importance. They moved with quiet ease, placed their belongings neatly, and settled into their seat without drawing attention from anyone around them. To the rest of the cabin, they were just another face. Another traveler among many. And perhaps that was the very reason the moment that followed unfolded the way it did. Because when people believe someone is ordinary, they sometimes treat them accordingly. The flight began smoothly. The aircraft lifted into the sky with steady precision. The ground disappeared beneath the clouds. And within minutes, the world outside the window became distant and quiet. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere softened. Seat belts loosened. Passengers leaned back. Some closed their eyes. Others began small conversations that faded in and out like distant echoes. It was the kind of stillness that makes time feel slower. The kind of stillness that invites reflection. And yet, beneath that calm surface, something had already begun. Something that no one fully understood yet. Because as the flight settled into its rhythm, a quiet imbalance took shape. And by the time anyone realized it, it would already be too late to pretend it hadn't happened. As the aircraft reached cruising altitude, the structure of the flight began to unfold in the way it always does. Predictable. Organized. Almost automatic. The service started. Small gestures first. A drink offered. A blanket adjusted. A polite exchange of words that carried just enough warmth to feel human, but not enough to interrupt the quiet order of the cabin. Passengers responded in their own ways. Some smiled. Some nodded. Some barely looked up from their screens. Each person existed in their own small world, temporarily sharing space with strangers they would likely never see again. The traveler remained still. Observing. Not critically. Not emotionally. Just present. There is a certain kind of awareness that comes from stillness. A way of noticing details that others overlook. A way of sensing shifts before they fully appear. And as the service moved through the cabin, that awareness became important. Row by row, comfort was extended. Care was offered. Small details were handled with quiet efficiency. Nothing extraordinary. Just consistency. And consistency, in environments like that, is what creates a sense of fairness. Everyone receives the same attention. The same care. The same acknowledgement. At least, that is what is expected. But when the service reached the traveler's row, something changed. Not dramatically. Not in a way that would immediately draw attention. But enough. Enough to create a difference. Enough to be felt. The interaction was shorter. The tone more distant. The presence less engaged. A request, simple, reasonable, ordinary, was met with acknowledgement, but not fulfillment. At first, it felt like timing. Perhaps it would be addressed in a moment. Perhaps something had been delayed. So the traveler waited. Calmly. Patiently. Because not every moment requires reaction. Time passed. Service continued. Passengers nearby received what they needed. Requests were answered. Comfort was extended. But the absence remained. What had been acknowledged had not been delivered. And slowly, what felt like timing began to feel like something else. Something more deliberate. Something less accidental. And yet, the traveler did not react. There was no visible frustration. No attempt to draw attention. No effort to force a correction. Because sometimes, the clearest understanding comes not from what happens, but from what doesn't. Around them, the cabin remained unchanged. Soft light. Muted voices. The steady hum of the aircraft moving through the sky. Everything appeared normal. But for the traveler, the moment had already shifted. And for a few quiet observers nearby, something didn't feel entirely right anymore. Not enough to act, but enough to notice. And sometimes, noticing is where everything begins. Here is a moment when uncertainty becomes understanding. A moment when something that could have been dismissed as coincidence begins to feel intentional. That moment arrived quietly. Without announcement. Without change in tone. But it was there. The traveler had already waited longer than necessary. Long enough to allow for delays. Long enough to allow for oversight. Long enough to give the moment the benefit of doubt. And yet, nothing had changed. The same request remained unfulfilled. The same absence remained present. Not ignored completely. But not addressed either. And that is where the difference lies. Because being unseen is one thing. But being seen, and still left without response, is something else entirely. The traveler shifted slightly. Not out of discomfort, but out of clarity. A decision, forming not from emotion, but from understanding. They raised their hand gently. Not high enough to draw attention from the entire cabin. Just enough to be noticed by the person responsible for responding. The gesture was calm. Measured. Controlled. It was not a demand. It was not a complaint. It was simply a continuation of the moment that had already begun. When the attendant approached, the exchange was brief. Polite. Almost indistinguishable from the many other interactions taking place throughout the cabin. The traveler spoke softly, repeating the request. No added emotion. No change in tone. Just clarity. And the response came just as calmly. Acknowledgement. A short reply. A slight nod. Words that suggested the request had been heard. And yet, no action followed. The attendant moved on. Just as before. And in that small, nearly invisible moment, everything became clear. Because sometimes, what confirms a situation is not what is said, but what is not done. The traveler did not react. Not outwardly. There was no visible disappointment. No attempt to question further. No need to repeat what had already been understood. Instead, they leaned back slightly, returning to stillness. But this stillness was different. Not passive. Not uncertain. It was the stillness of someone who had seen enough. Around them, the cabin continued as if nothing had happened. But for those who had quietly observed the exchange, something felt different now. The absence had become visible. The imbalance, undeniable. And yet, like many moments in life, it remained unspoken. Because people often hesitate to step into situations that are not theirs, even when they know something is not right. And so the cabin remained quiet. But no longer unaware. Time moved forward, but the moment did not disappear. It settled. Deepened. became part of the atmosphere itself. The lights dimmed slightly as the flight entered a quieter phase. The outside world faded into darkness. Inside, the cabin softened into a calm, almost reflective state. Passengers adjusted their seats. Some closed their eyes. Others continued watching, reading, existing within their own quiet spaces. But beneath that calm, something had shifted. The traveler remained composed. Still. Unchanged in posture. Unchanged in expression. But within that stillness, a decision had already been made. Not reactive. Not emotional. But intentional. There are moments when action is not about response, but about correction. And this was one of those moments. The traveler reached for their phone. The movement was slow. Deliberate. Almost unnoticeable to anyone not paying close attention. There was no urgency in the gesture. No visible frustration. Just intention. The phone was unlocked. A number selected. And then, a call. No one nearby could hear what was said. There were no raised voices. No sharp tones. Just a quiet conversation. Brief. Precise. Controlled. Words exchanged with purpose, not emotion. And just as calmly as it began, the call ended. The phone was placed back down. And once again, stillness. But this stillness carried weight. Because something had been set in motion. Something invisible, but real. At first, nothing appeared to change. The cabin remained quiet. The same rhythm continued. But then, subtle shifts began to emerge. A glance exchanged between two members of the crew. A pause where there hadn't been one before. A brief conversation near the front of the cabin that ended more quickly than expected. Movements became slightly more measured. More aware. More careful. It was not obvious. Not dramatic. But it was there. And for those who were paying attention, it was unmistakable. Because the kind of change that follows quiet authority does not announce itself. It reveals itself slowly. Through behavior. Through awareness. Through the subtle realization that something has been understood, without being explained. The same attendants who once moved with effortless routine now moved with intention. Their expressions remained professional. Their tone remained calm. But their presence had changed. There was caution now. And awareness. And something else. Something unspoken. Because whatever had been said during that quiet call had been heard. And though no one in the cabin knew exactly what had been communicated, everyone could feel that something had shifted. The traveler remained still. Unmoved. Unchanged. Because the purpose of the call had never been to create disruption. It had never been to expose or embarrass. It had simply been to correct what should have never required correction. And now, that correction was beginning to take shape. Quietly. Just as it had begun. The shift did not happen all at once. It never does. Real change, especially the kind that follows quiet authority, arrives gradually. Almost gently. As if testing whether it has been noticed. At first, it was only visible in small details. The way the crew moved. The way their attention lingered just a moment longer than before. The way their conversations became shorter, more deliberate. Then, without announcement, the service returned to the traveler's row. Not rushed. Not exaggerated. But different. There was intention now. A presence that had been missing earlier. The same request that had once been acknowledged but not fulfilled was now addressed. Carefully. Completely. Without explanation. And that is what made the moment powerful. Because no apology was spoken. No justification offered. No acknowledgement of what had changed. And yet, everything had. The traveler looked up briefly. Not with surprise. Not with satisfaction. But with quiet recognition. The kind of recognition that comes when something expected finally arrives, not because it was demanded, but because it was understood. They accepted what was offered. Calmly. Without emphasis. Without drawing attention to the shift. Because the moment was never about receiving anything. It was about restoring balance. And that balance had now returned. Around them, a few passengers noticed. Not everyone. But those who had been paying attention from the beginning. They saw the difference. They felt it. The contrast between what had been and what now was. The same crew that had once moved past that seat without pause now approached with care. With awareness. With a quiet understanding that something had been corrected. And yet, no one spoke about it. Because there are moments when words are unnecessary. Moments when explanation would only reduce the meaning of what has already been understood. The traveler returned to stillness. Just as they had been from the beginning. Unchanged. Because true authority does not shift with circumstance. It remains steady, regardless of how others behave. And in that steadiness, there is power. The rest of the flight continued in silence. But not the same silence as before. This silence carried awareness. A quiet reflection that moved through the cabin without needing to be acknowledged. Because even those who had not fully understood what had happened could feel that something had. And sometimes, feeling is enough.